What happens when the architect of the digital revolution becomes the villain of his own creation? On May 18, 1998, the United States Department of Justice, along with 20 U.S. states, filed an antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft Corporation. The allegation was as bold as it was damning. Microsoft had illegally maintained its monopoly on personal computer operating systems and sought to extend that dominance to the burgeoning market of internet browsers. At the center of this legal maelstrom stood Bill Gates, a tech wunderkind turned business titan now facing the gravest challenge of his career. The media frenzy was electric. Headlines screamed that the mighty Microsoft was finally being held accountable. Television screens across America looped clips of Gates in a deposition room, his composure cracking under the relentless questioning of government attorneys. His once celebrated genius now seemed shrouded in a cold, calculating glare. For a generation that had grown up revering Gates as a visionary, this was an unsettling reversal. Microsoft, the company that had put a computer in every home, was now being portrayed as a corporate predator, willing to suffocate innovation to protect their empire. But the courtroom drama was only the surface. Behind the public spectacle, a more insidious narrative was unfolding, one that involved secret memos, backroom deals, and a fundamental question about who gets to control the future of technology. The lawsuit was not merely about bundling Internet Explorer with Windows. It was about the architecture of digital power and the invisible levers that could shape markets, crush competitors, and dictate the rules of innovation itself. Microsoft's strategy was subtle yet devastating: embrace emerging technologies, extend their influence through integration, and extinguish competition by leveraging their control over the Windows operating system. This method wasn't just aggressive, it was systemic, embedding Microsoft's dominance into the very framework of the digital economy. The trial, in essence, was not just about a company's overreach. It was about exposing an entire operating philosophy that blurred the lines between competitive excellence and monopolistic abuse. Yet, amidst the legal jargon and corporate testimonies, a deeper intrigue persisted. How did a company that started with the noble mission of a computer on every desk and in every home become the focal point of the largest antitrust case since Standard Oil? Was Microsoft's monopoly the result of superior innovation, or had they rewritten the rules of competition itself? And most importantly, what does this battle tell us about the fragile balance between technological progress and unchecked corporate power? To uncover the real story, we need to go back to the genesis of Microsoft, the seeds of its dominance, and the invisible war that redefined the digital age.
Why would a company that revolutionized personal computing, democratizing access to technology, suddenly become a threat to the very innovation it once championed? At its core, the Microsoft antitrust case posed a question far more unsettling than mere legalities. When does dominance stop being a reward for brilliance and start becoming a systemic danger? Throughout the 1990s, Microsoft was not just a company, it was the gatekeeper of the digital frontier. With Windows installed on over 90% of personal computers worldwide, they didn't just compete in the marketplace, they defined it. Every software developer, hardware manufacturer, and emerging tech startup had to navigate the ecosystem Microsoft controlled. On paper, this success was a testament to the company's relentless innovation and business acumen. But beneath the surface, regulators and competitors saw a different reality, one where Microsoft's influence wasn't just earned, but engineered through a reconfiguration of the competitive landscape itself. Was Microsoft simply playing the game better than anyone else, or had they rewritten the rules in their favor? Their tactics, such as bundling Internet Explorer with Windows, pressuring OEMs to exclude rival software, and leveraging exclusive contracts, blurred the line between strategic competition and predatory dominance. To critics, this wasn't just aggressive business, It was the digital equivalent of closing off every road except the one you owned, ensuring no one else could even begin the race. Yet the controversy ran deeper than the immediate market effects. It raised existential questions about the architecture of technological progress in a capitalist society. Should the market's invisible hand be trusted to regulate itself, even when a single entity controls the platform upon which others must innovate? Or was there a threshold, an invisible line, where corporate success morphs into systemic risk, stifling the very competition that fuels technological advancement? This wasn't the first time America grappled with such questions. The echoes of Standard Oil's monopoly in the early 20th century or AT&T's stranglehold over telecommunications loomed large in the public consciousness. But Microsoft's case was unprecedented. It wasn't about controlling physical commodities or infrastructure. It was about controlling access to innovation in a digital economy where code, platforms, and standards defined the playing field. The lawsuit forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths. Could a company born from entrepreneurial genius evolve into a monopolistic leviathan, not through overt coercion, but by subtly embedding itself into every layer of the market? And if so, was the existing legal framework, crafted in the era of railroads and oil barons, equipped to police such new age empires? To find the answers, we must go back to the beginning, back to a small partnership in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where two young programmers, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, set out with a simple dream: to create software that would change the world. Little did they know, their ambition would plant the first seeds of a corporate empire that would one day be powerful enough to bend the digital world to its will.
In 1975, in a modest motel room in Albuquerque, New Mexico, two childhood friends stared at the future. Bill Gates and Paul Allen, both self-taught programming prodigies, had just seen a cover story in Popular Electronics featuring the Altair 8800, the world's first commercially available microcomputer. To the outside world, the Altair was a quirky hobbyist's toy, limited in power and potential. But to Gates and Allen, it was a spark, a vision that one day personal computers would no longer be the exclusive domain of scientists and corporations. The revolution was inevitable. Someone just needed to write the code that would ignite it. Microsoft was born out of that vision. Their first product wasn't a sleek operating system or a polished application. It was a basic interpreter designed to breathe life into the Altair. The company's name itself was a testament to their ambition: Microsoft, a fusion of microcomputer and software. In those early days, Gates and Allen weren't thinking about monopolies or market dominance. They were idealistic engineers chasing a dream of putting computing power into the hands of ordinary people. But the seeds of Microsoft's future dominance were already there, rooted in Gates's relentless drive for perfection and control. Even in 1976, a 21-year-old Bill Gates penned an open letter to hobbyists, chastising software pirates for copying Microsoft's BASIC without paying. It wasn't just about revenue, it was about asserting that software, intangible though it was, held immense value and deserved to be protected, controlled, and monetized. As Microsoft's reputation grew, so did its ambitions. The pivotal moment came in 1980 when IBM approached Microsoft with an urgent request. IBM was developing its first personal computer and needed an operating system. Microsoft didn't have one. But Gates, ever the strategist, struck a deal to license an existing OS from a small company called Seattle Computer Products. They rebranded it as MS-DOS and licensed it to IBM, not as an outright sale, but with the rights to license it to other manufacturers as well. That decision, a masterstroke of business foresight, would lay the foundation for Microsoft's empire. By retaining licensing rights, Microsoft ensured that as the PC market exploded, every clone manufacturer, Compaq, Dell, Gateway, would need to come to them for software. Unlike Apple,
which controlled both hardware and software in a closed ecosystem, Microsoft positioned itself as the indispensable software provider for an entire industry. The genius of this model was in its subtlety. Microsoft didn't need to build every PC. It just needed to be the common denominator that tied them all together. With each new machine sold, Microsoft's influence deepened, not through brute force, but through an architecture of quiet inevitability. By the late 1980s, MS-DOS was ubiquitous. Microsoft had become the unseen backbone of the personal computing revolution. Yet this early success wasn't accompanied by hubris, at least not yet. Gates and Allen remained, on the surface, the archetypal tech nerds, brilliant, awkward, and singularly obsessed with code. But beneath that veneer, Gates, in particular, harbored a laser-focused vision to not just participate in the personal computing revolution, but to define it. The dream was no longer just a computer on every desk, but Microsoft software on every screen. It was a dream that would soon demand more than innovation. It would require strategy, aggression, and an uncompromising grip on the evolving digital ecosystem. And so, from the humble beginnings of a basic interpreter in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the seeds of a monopoly began to take root.
By the mid-1980s, Microsoft had outgrown its humble Albuquerque origins. The company relocated to Redmond, Washington, where a campus of concrete and glass would soon become the command center of a digital empire. But even as MS-DOS became the de facto standard for personal computers, Bill Gates knew that software alone wasn't enough. The future belonged to the operating system that could unify the increasingly fragmented world of PC hardware and software into a seamless, user-friendly experience. That future was called Windows. In 1985, Microsoft launched Windows 1.0. It wasn't an immediate success. Critics derided it as clunky, slow, and derivative of Apple's Macintosh interface. But Gates understood something his competitors underestimated. Control over the operating system wasn't about winning the first round. It was about becoming the indispensable platform upon which all other software would rely. Windows was a long game, a Trojan horse that would eventually redefine how people interacted with their machines. The breakthrough came with Windows 3.0 in 1990. This version, with its improved graphics, enhanced multitasking, and broader hardware compatibility, captured the market's imagination. Software developers flocked to build applications optimized for Windows. OEMs, original mechanical equipment manufacturers, found it easier to pre-install Windows on their machines rather than navigate the chaos of alternative systems. Microsoft's strategy was simple yet effective. Make Windows the default environment for computing, so pervasive that any alternative would seem foreign and inconvenient. It was during this period that Microsoft began to develop its signature competitive playbook. Partnerships were structured with a gravitational pull. Once a hardware maker signed a licensing deal, leaving the Windows ecosystem became economically and technically prohibitive. Developers were incentivized to write software using Microsoft's proprietary APIs, ensuring their programs would run best or exclusively on Windows. In parallel, Microsoft diversified its product line. Microsoft Office, introduced in 1990, bundled Word, Excel, and PowerPoint into an integrated suite that quickly became the gold standard for productivity software. By offering seamless compatibility between its operating system and applications, Microsoft created a self-reinforcing ecosystem. If you used Windows, you were encouraged to use Office, and if you used Office, you needed Windows. Competitors like Lotus, WordPerfect, and Novell found themselves in a race they couldn't win. Their products might have been superior in isolation, but Microsoft ecosystem strategy rendered them fragmented and cumbersome by comparison. Gates understood that winning wasn't just about having the best software. It was about controlling the platform, the standards, the very fabric of how users and developers interacted with technology. By the early 1990s, Microsoft's dominance was no longer just a possibility.
It was becoming an inevitability. The company had mastered the subtle art of embedding itself into every layer of the computing experience. From the BIOS up to the user interface, Microsoft's fingerprints were everywhere. And yet, to the average consumer, it all felt like a natural progression. Few questioned why every new PC came with Windows, or why alternatives seemed scarce. The convenience was undeniable. The control was invisible. But with each strategic partnership, each exclusive contract, and each quiet acquisition, Microsoft was weaving a web designed to entangle not just their competitors, but the entire technology industry itself. What began as a dream of bringing software to the masses was evolving into an architecture of dominance, carefully constructed, meticulously maintained, and, in the eyes of regulators, increasingly suspicious. The foundation of Microsoft's empire had been laid. The next chapter would be about fortifying it, expanding it, and defending it at all costs.
By the early 1990s, Microsoft was no longer content with being a dominant player in the software industry. It was becoming the gravitational center of the entire technology ecosystem. The release of Windows 3.1 in 1992 solidified Microsoft's position as the default operating system for personal computers worldwide. Within a year, it sold over 3 million copies, an unprecedented feat that signaled not just market success, but a cultural shift. Owning a PC now meant owning Windows. But Microsoft's ambitions extended far beyond selling operating systems. Bill Gates envisioned a future where Microsoft would control the entire computing experience, from the moment a computer powered on to the applications users relied upon daily. It was not just about market share. It was about embedding Microsoft into the very architecture of modern life. One of the key pillars of this strategy was Microsoft Office. By the mid-1990s, Office had obliterated its competitors, Lotus 1-2-3, WordPerfect, and Harvard Graphics, through a lethal combination of aggressive bundling and technical integration. Microsoft offered steep discounts to OEMs that pre-installed Office alongside Windows, effectively making it the default productivity suite for both corporate and personal users. Competitors found themselves locked out of distribution channels, their products rendered irrelevant in a market that increasingly demanded seamless compatibility with Windows. But Microsoft's expansion wasn't limited to software. They ventured aggressively into enterprise solutions, capturing large corporations with their Windows NT operating systems and server software. Each segment conquered. Desktops, productivity suites, and enterprise infrastructure fed into the other, creating a feedback loop that tightened Microsoft's grip on the industry. Strategic acquisitions became another weapon in Microsoft's arsenal. Companies with innovative technologies were either acquired or strategically undermined. In 1995, as the Internet began to emerge as the next frontier, Microsoft recognized the threat posed by Netscape Navigator. At the time, Netscape controlled over 70% of the browser market, and its cross-platform nature was a direct challenge to Microsoft's Windows-centric world. Microsoft's response was swift and unforgiving. The company launched Internet Explorer, a browser deeply integrated into Windows 95's operating system. But it wasn't just the product that changed the game, it was the strategy. Microsoft began bundling Internet Explorer for free with every copy of Windows, turning what had been a standalone software market into a feature war embedded in the OS itself. OEMs were encouraged, often through financial incentives and licensing pressure, to favor Internet Explorer and obscure or remove Netscape from their pre-installed software packages. The browser wars had begun, but they were never fought on an even battlefield. Microsoft's control over the Windows platform allowed it to dictate the terms of engagement, leveraging its dominance not through superior product features, but through systemic influence over distribution channels and user defaults. Meanwhile, Microsoft's revenue exploded.
By 1996, the company reported annual revenues exceeding $8 billion, with profits soaring past $2 billion. Its market capitalization surpassed $100 billion, making it one of the most valuable companies on Earth. But within these staggering numbers lay a structural reality. Microsoft wasn't just growing, it was consolidating. Every percentage point of market share gained by Windows or Internet Explorer wasn't just a win in competition. It was a step towards creating an ecosystem where alternatives simply ceased to exist. To Microsoft, this expansion was a natural extension of competitive excellence. But to regulators, competitors, and an increasingly wary public, it was beginning to look like something entirely else. A corporate stranglehold that could suffocate innovation and manipulate market dynamics from behind the curtain. The seeds of discontent had been sown. The whispers of monopoly were growing louder, and soon those whispers would become a clarion call for a legal reckoning.
By 1997, Microsoft was no longer merely the dominant force in personal computing. It had become the axis around which the entire technology industry rotated. Competitors who once seemed formidable were now shadows of their former selves, struggling to breathe in a marketplace that had been systematically re-engineered to favor Microsoft at every level. The most glaring casualty of this transformation was Netscape Communications. Once the darling of Silicon Valley, Netscape Navigator had introduced millions to the World Wide Web. But Microsoft's bundling of Internet Explorer with Windows was a strategic chokehold. Netscape, which relied on selling its browser as a standalone product, found itself undercut by Microsoft's free offering, an offering that came pre-installed on the operating system used by 90% of the world's PCs. The battlefield wasn't fair, and that was by design. Microsoft's licensing agreements with OEMs often included stipulations that disincentivized or outright prohibited the promotion of rival browsers. OEMs who dared to challenge this arrangement risked losing access to Windows licenses or faced punitive pricing structures. For many, the choice was simple: comply or risk extinction. But Netscape wasn't alone in this silent war of attrition. Productivity software giants like word processing and Lotus 1-2-3, once synonymous with word processing and spreadsheets, were gradually pushed to the periphery. Microsoft Office's deep integration with Windows, both technically and in terms of default user experience, rendered competing suites cumbersome and incompatible. Even when alternatives offered superior features, the seamless convenience of Microsoft's ecosystem made deviation an uphill battle consumers were unwilling to climb. This wasn't just about superior products, it was about the architecture of dominance. Microsoft's control over APIs, application programming interfaces, meant that developers had little choice but to build software optimized for Windows. The more developers catered to Microsoft standards, the more indispensable Windows became. It was a self-perpetuating cycle where every new product, every new user, and every new PC only deepened Microsoft's grip on the industry. Market analysts began publishing reports with stark warnings. By 1997, Internet Explorer's market share had risen to over 40%, while Netscape's fell precipitously. Surveys of corporate IT departments revealed that Windows NT was rapidly becoming the default choice for enterprise infrastructure, marginalizing rivals like Novell NetWare. The software landscape was evolving, not through open competition, but through an ecosystem designed to eliminate friction for users who stayed within Microsoft's walls and to erect barriers for those who sought alternatives. The effect was palpable. Industry voices who once championed open competition began to fall silent. Smaller competitors, unable to secure distribution or market visibility, either pivoted into niche markets or vanished entirely. The air of innovation that had characterized the early years of the PC revolution was being replaced by an unsettling quiet, a quiet where Microsoft's presence was ubiquitous and dissenting alternatives were invisible. Even more insidious was the psychological impact on the market. For new startups and developers, the message was clear. To succeed,
You had to play by Microsoft's rules. Competing against them wasn't just difficult, it was structurally impossible. The rules of the game had been rewritten, and Microsoft was both player and referee. The tech press began referring to Microsoft's dominance as a benevolent dictatorship, a phrase that captured the paradox of a company whose products were beloved by consumers, but whose business practices were suffocating the very competition that spurred progress. But whispers of discontent were beginning to swell. Antitrust regulators, consumer advocates, and sidelined competitors were preparing to challenge the empire. The monopoly that had been built in silence was about to be dragged into the spotlight.
For years, Microsoft's dominance had been expanding with little public resistance. Competitors faded quietly, OEMs acquiesced, and consumers, enamored by convenience, seldom questioned why alternatives felt increasingly scarce. But by 1997, faint murmurs of discontent began to pierce the silence. The first cracks in Microsoft's impenetrable fortress were appearing, not as grand gestures of rebellion, but as subtle, persistent challenges from those who dared to voice what others only whispered. One of the earliest and most vocal dissenters was Netscape Communications. Their struggle wasn't just about market share, it was a fight for survival. In a bold move, Netscape's executives began speaking out publicly about Microsoft's tactics. At industry conferences and press briefings, they detailed how OEMs were being coerced into bundling Internet Explorer, effectively locking Netscape out of the distribution channels vital for its growth. Netscape's general counsel, Gary Reback, became a pivotal figure in amplifying these concerns. Reback, a tenacious and eloquent advocate, began briefing members of Congress, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Department of Justice about Microsoft's predatory practices. He didn't just rely on rhetoric. Reback presented a systematic case, detailing how Microsoft's contractual arrangements, bundling strategies, and control over APIs were constructing an ecosystem where competition couldn't breathe. In April 1996, Scott McNealy, CEO of Sun Microsystems, publicly accused Microsoft of using its dominance to stifle innovation. "We're witnessing the return of digital feudalism," McNealy warned, "where one company owns the castle and everyone else is taxed just for passing through." Sun's grievances weren't isolated. Their Java programming language, designed to be platform independent, was facing strategic sabotage from Microsoft, which had created a proprietary version of Java that only functioned optimally on Windows. Meanwhile, independent journalists and tech columnists began to shine a light on the structural implications of Microsoft's business model. Walt Mossberg, writing for the Wall Street Journal, questioned the long-term consequences of allowing a single company to control both the operating system and key applications that defined the user experience. The Washington Post and the New York Times published investigative pieces examining how Microsoft's tactics affected not just competitors, but consumer choice itself. Consumer advocacy groups like the Computer and Communications Industry Association, or CCIA, started lobbying regulators, framing Microsoft's actions not merely as corporate aggression, but as a fundamental threat to the principles of open competition that fueled America's technological leadership. Even within the corridors of power, concerns were stirring. In 1997, Joel Klein, head of the DOJ's Antitrust Division, began scrutinizing Microsoft's practices more intently. While initial investigations had focused on specific infractions, such as bundling Internet Explorer with Windows 95, the narrative was shifting. It was no longer just about a browser. It was about a pattern, a methodical re-engineering of market dynamics to ensure Microsoft's supremacy. But despite these growing murmurs, Microsoft remained defiant.
Publicly, executives dismissed these complaints as sour grapes from companies unable to compete. Bill Gates, in interviews, emphasized that Microsoft's success was the product of relentless innovation and consumer demand, not coercion. However, beneath the surface, the company's legal teams were preparing. The complaints were gaining traction, regulators were asking sharper questions, and the media was no longer satisfied with boilerplate responses. The fortress wasn't crumbling yet, but the foundation was beginning to tremble. What had started as isolated grievances was coalescing into a movement that would soon evolve from press releases and conference speeches into subpoenas and courtroom battles.
By late 1997, the mounting complaints against Microsoft had grown too substantial for Washington to ignore. The Department of Justice, DOJ, under the leadership of Antitrust Chief Joel Klein, shifted from passive observation to active scrutiny. For years, Microsoft had operated in a regulatory gray zone, innovating faster than laws could catch up, exploiting legal ambiguities crafted in an era of oil barons and railroads. But the digital economy was no longer a fringe industry. It was rapidly becoming the backbone of global commerce, and Microsoft stood at its very core. Klein, a sharp and methodical prosecutor, recognized that the challenge wasn't just proving individual acts of misconduct. The real battle was to unravel the systemic nature of Microsoft's market control. His team began piecing together a mosaic of contracts, memos, and testimonies that painted a picture far more damning than any singular violation. Microsoft wasn't just competing aggressively, it was orchestrating an ecosystem where competition itself became structurally impossible. On October 20, 1997, the DOJ filed a motion in federal court accusing Microsoft of violating a 1995 consent decree, which had originally been negotiated to prevent anti-competitive bundling practices. The accusation was clear. Microsoft's integration of Internet Explorer into Windows 95 wasn't about innovation or user benefit. It was a deliberate move to leverage their operating system monopoly to dominate the browser market. But Klein's team wasn't alone in their pursuit. A coalition of 20 U.S. state attorneys general, led by states like California, New York, and Massachusetts, launched parallel investigations. These states, emboldened by mounting evidence and public support, coordinated their efforts with the DOJ, creating a formidable alliance of federal and state legal forces. The message was unambiguous. The era of unchecked digital dominance was over. Congressional hearings soon followed. In March 1998, the Senate Judiciary Committee summoned Bill Gates to testify. Under the glare of television cameras and a battery of skeptical senators, Gates delivered a carefully rehearsed defense, emphasizing Microsoft's contributions to the economy, job creation, and technological progress. But the tone in Washington had shifted. Senators pressed him on the ethical implications of Microsoft's bundling strategies, the coercion of OEMs, and the stifling of emerging competitors. Meanwhile, the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, ramped up its own investigations, collaborating with the DOJ to analyze Microsoft's licensing agreements and developer contracts. Internal Microsoft documents, once guarded with fortress-like security, began surfacing through subpoenas. Among them were memos that starkly revealed the company's aggressive internal mindset. Phrases like "cut off Netscape's air supply" and "embrace, extend, extinguish" transformed abstract suspicions into concrete evidence of intent. But Microsoft wasn't idle. The company mobilized an army of lobbyists in Washington, flooding Capitol Hill with arguments about free market principles, innovation incentives, and America's competitive edge against foreign tech giants. They portrayed the antitrust scrutiny as government overreach, an archaic misunderstanding of how fast-moving digital markets functioned. Yet beneath this public relations blitz, Microsoft's legal teams were bracing for an inevitable confrontation. Regulators, on the other hand, understood they were entering uncharted territory.
No precedent existed to dismantle a digital monopoly of this scale. The laws were there, chiefly the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, but their application to a 1990s tech titan would require precision, resilience, and a battle of narratives in both courtrooms and public opinion. The initial motions, hearings, and subpoenas were just the opening salvo. The slow, deliberate machinery of antitrust enforcement had been set into motion, and while the gears turned slowly, their momentum was now irreversible. Microsoft's empire was under official scrutiny. The battle lines had been drawn.
As the Department of Justice and a coalition of 20 states escalated their antitrust investigations, Microsoft found itself in an unfamiliar position, not as the disruptor, but as the besieged. Yet, true to its corporate DNA, Microsoft's response was neither panicked nor reactive. It was methodical, strategic, and cloaked in the calm confidence of a company that believed it could outmaneuver regulators just as deftly as it had outpaced competitors. Publicly, Microsoft maintained an air of dismissive defiance. Bill Gates, in interviews and press conferences, framed the scrutiny as a fundamental misunderstanding of how technology markets evolved. "We are not preventing anyone from competing with us," Gates stated in a 1998 interview. "The marketplace is dynamic. The competition is just one click away." This narrative of a rapidly evolving tech landscape where market dominance was temporary and innovation was the ultimate equalizer became the backbone of Microsoft's PR offensive. Behind the scenes, however, the tone was more measured. Microsoft's legal team, led by high-profile attorneys such as William Newcomb, meticulously crafted defenses that pivoted on two main arguments: consumer benefit and market dynamism. They emphasized that bundling Internet Explorer with Windows added value for consumers, provided at no additional cost, and was a natural progression of software integration, not a monopolistic tactic. Simultaneously, Microsoft began deploying an aggressive lobbying campaign in Washington, D.C. The company's political action committees funneled contributions to key lawmakers, while a cadre of lobbyists worked to reshape the narrative, presenting Microsoft as a national champion whose innovation was vital for America's global competitiveness. The argument was subtle but potent. Undermining Microsoft would weaken the U.S. in the international tech race, particularly against rising foreign rivals like Japan's electronics giants and Europe's nascent software firms. Internally, Microsoft also reassessed its structural defenses. The company explored legal maneuvers to segment certain business units, not as a genuine concession to antitrust pressures, but as a tactical buffer to diffuse potential penalties. Departments were instructed to maintain meticulous documentation of product innovations that could be framed as consumer-centric rather than competition-centric. The objective was clear: build a fortress of pro-innovation evidence that could withstand judicial scrutiny. Moreover, Microsoft intensified its technical integration strategies. Rather than retreat from bundling, the company doubled down, embedding Internet Explorer deeper into the Windows operating system. In a pivotal internal memo, Gates instructed teams to make Internet Explorer an integral part of Windows, to the point where removing it would destabilize the OS itself. This wasn't just a technical evolution, it was a legal shield, designed to argue that separating the browser from Windows was impractical, if not impossible. At the same time, Microsoft quietly reached out to OEMs and software partners, leveraging its dominance in other areas to secure loyalty amidst the rising regulatory storm. These weren't overt threats, they were veiled reminders of the mutual dependencies that had been carefully nurtured over the years. For OEMs whose entire product lines relied on favorable Windows licensing terms, the message was clear: standing with Microsoft was in their best interest. But not all reactions were defensive. Microsoft also went on the offensive against its critics.
The company publicly questioned the motives of competitors like Netscape and Sun Microsystems, portraying their complaints as attempts to compensate for inferior products. In press releases and interviews, Microsoft painted itself as the innovator, while its detractors were framed as sore losers seeking regulatory intervention to succeed where they had failed in the marketplace. Yet beneath this calculated counterattack, there were signs of unease. Leaked internal emails revealed a company acutely aware of the stakes, with executives acknowledging that a misstep could lead to structural remedies far more severe than mere fines. The specter of a corporate breakup loomed, an outcome that Microsoft's leadership was determined to avoid at any cost. As the regulatory noose tightened, Microsoft's response was a masterclass in strategic containment: deny, deflect, integrate deeper, and outlast. But the company was about to face a challenge it couldn't outmaneuver with press releases or lobbying: the formal filing of a lawsuit that would put its entire business model on trial.
On May 18, 1998, the battle lines were drawn in ink and filed in federal court. The United States Department of Justice, joined by 20 U.S. states and the District of Columbia, officially launched an antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft Corporation. The case, filed under Section 2 of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, accused Microsoft of unlawfully maintaining its monopoly in the PC operating system market and engaging in anti-competitive practices designed to squash emerging threats, most notably in the web browser space. The complaint was as sweeping as it was surgical. It detailed how Microsoft had leveraged its 90% dominance of the PC operating system market to tie Internet Explorer to Windows, not as an enhancement for consumers, but as a strategic blockade against rivals like Netscape. The lawsuit alleged that Microsoft's contracts with computer manufacturers, OEMs, were structured to disincentivize the installation of competing software. More damningly, it accused Microsoft of deliberately designing Windows to make the removal of Internet Explorer either technically infeasible or so disruptive to the system that OEMs had no practical choice but to comply. But the lawsuit didn't stop at browsers. It painted a broader picture of a company engaged in a pattern of predatory practices, using its OS monopoly as a blunt instrument to dictate terms to hardware makers, software developers, and consumers alike. The DOJ's complaint labeled Microsoft's tactics as a course of conduct designed to extend its operating system monopoly to other software markets. For Microsoft, the filing wasn't a surprise, but the scale of the offensive was unprecedented. 20 states, led by California and New York, had joined forces with the federal government, forming a legal phalanx that Microsoft couldn't dismiss as bureaucratic overreach. This wasn't just a courtroom skirmish. It was shaping up to be a defining legal battle for the digital age. The media explosion was immediate. Front pages across America proclaimed the beginning of the trial of Microsoft. Financial analysts speculated wildly on the implications. Would the government seek to break Microsoft apart, as it had with Standard Oil nearly a century earlier? Could this spell the end of Bill Gates' unchecked reign over the software world? On Wall Street, Microsoft's stock wobbled but didn't collapse. Investors were still betting on Gates' ability to navigate the storm. But public opinion, however, was shifting. While many consumers admired Microsoft's innovations, there was a growing unease about the company's pervasive influence. Stories of Netscape's decline, Sun Microsystems' frustrations, and the dwindling of once prominent competitors began to coalesce into a narrative of the tech giant that played by its own rules that others couldn't possibly match. Inside Microsoft, the mood was combative yet controlled. Gates and his senior leadership team convened emergency strategy sessions, reviewing legal briefs and refining their public messaging. The official line was clear: Microsoft was being punished for innovating too well, for delivering integrated solutions that consumers demanded. Gates himself, in an internal memo, urged employees to stay focused and dismissed the lawsuit as a distraction, a bump in the road on Microsoft's path to continued technological leadership. But beneath the corporate bravado, there was an acute awareness that this was no ordinary litigation. This was a battle for the company's very architecture, a battle that would unfold in public view,
in front of cameras, reporters, and an increasingly skeptical judiciary. The stage was set, the players were in position, and as the first court summonses were delivered, it became clear this was not just a legal proceeding, it was the opening act of a corporate drama that would redefine the limits of market power in the digital age.
On October 19, 1998, the grand courtroom of the E. Barrett Prettyman United States Courthouse in Washington, D.C., became the arena for one of the most consequential legal battles in American business history. Rows of polished oak benches lined with journalists, analysts, and industry observers were packed to capacity. Television cameras, though barred from broadcasting live, were stationed outside, feeding a 24-hour news cycle hungry for every word, every glance, every slip. Presiding over the case was Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson, a jurist known for his meticulous attention to detail and a temperament that would soon become a defining factor in the trial's tone. Across from him sat the formidable legal teams. For the prosecution, the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division led by David Boies, a courtroom tactician renowned for his calm but relentless cross-examinations. For the defense, Microsoft's lead counsel John Warden, an equally seasoned litigator who had weathered many antitrust storms before. But all eyes, inevitably, were on Bill Gates, the architect of the modern PC revolution, the world's richest man, and now the reluctant defendant. Though Gates wasn't required to testify on the first day, his shadow loomed large. Clips of his earlier deposition, recorded and submitted as part of the pretrial process, had already begun circulating in the media. In these tapes, Gates appeared evasive, frequently answering "I don't recall" or engaging in verbal sparring over definitions of seemingly straightforward terms. What had been intended as a procedural formality had, through Gates' own guarded demeanor, morphed into a public relations disaster. The DOJ's opening statement was clinical, yet devastating. David Boies outlined the case with surgical precision, laying bare Microsoft's pattern of leveraging its Windows monopoly to stifle competition, not through superior products, but through contracts, technical sabotage, and strategic bundling designed to foreclose rivals from the market. Boies emphasized the broader implications. This case is not about punishing success. It's about ensuring that success doesn't become a gateway to systemic abuse. Microsoft's response was swift and unapologetic. John Warden delivered a robust defense, painting the DOJ's narrative as a fundamental misunderstanding of how software markets evolve. He argued that Microsoft's integration of Internet Explorer was a natural progression of consumer demand, not a coercive tactic. The real threat to innovation was government interference in a fast-moving industry where today's dominant player could become tomorrow's footnote. The courtroom crackled with tension as the first witnesses were called. Among them was James Barksdale, CEO of Netscape Communications. Calm and composed, Barksdale detailed how Microsoft's bundling of Internet Explorer had decimated Netscape's distribution channels. His testimony, delivered with the clarity of someone who had lived through a corporate siege, painted a vivid picture of how Microsoft's free browser wasn't a gift to consumers, but a weapon against competitors. But perhaps the most dramatic moments came when internal Microsoft documents were read into the record. Emails from senior Microsoft executives using phrases like "cut off Netscape's air supply" and "we will bind the web to Windows" electrified the room. These weren't abstract business strategies. They were confessions of intent, laid out bare in black and white. The defense pushed back, challenging the context of the emails, questioning the credibility of witnesses, and reiterating that bundling had always been part of Microsoft's innovation model. Yet, as each witness took the stand, a pattern began to emerge, one where Microsoft's business practices blurred the line between competitive excellence and systemic coercion. The first day of the trial didn't end with a knockout blow, but the tone was unmistakable. The courtroom wasn't just a venue for legal argument.
It had become a theater where Microsoft's culture, strategies, and ethics were being dissected in real time. Outside, as reporters filed their stories and analysts debated the day's proceedings, a consensus was forming. Microsoft was no longer in control of the narrative. The trial had officially begun, and the world was watching.
As the courtroom drama unfolded, Microsoft's legal team knew the stakes were rising with every damning email, every disgruntled competitor's testimony. The strategy now was to shift the narrative from one of corporate bullying to one of misunderstood innovation. Microsoft wasn't suffocating competition, they argued, it was pioneering integration that benefited millions of consumers. Lead counsel John Warden took the offensive. He painted the Department of Justice as out of touch with the rapidly evolving software industry. "We are not living in the age of oil monopolies," he declared during cross-examination. "In technology, the only constant is change. Yesterday's leaders become today's obsolete footnotes. Competition is one click away." This refrain, that the internet made monopolies obsolete, became Microsoft's central line of defense. Microsoft insisted that bundling Internet Explorer into Windows 95 was a technological evolution, not a strategic maneuver to crush Netscape. Their argument hinged on consumer convenience, a single, seamless interface where the operating system and the web browser functioned as one cohesive experience. "Consumers benefit from integration," Warden repeated. "They don't want fragmented software environments. They want products that work out of the box." The defense brought forward a cadre of expert witnesses, economists, software engineers, and market analysts who testified that the software industry was inherently volatile. They cited examples of once dominant companies like IBM and Lotus, arguing that technological superiority could be fleeting. Microsoft's dominance, they claimed, wasn't guaranteed. It was a fragile product of relentless innovation. One particularly pointed defense came from Richard Schmalensteen, dean of MIT's Sloan School of Management. Schmalensteen argued that bundling wasn't coercion, it was evolution. He likened it to car manufacturers including air conditioning as a standard feature. "The market demands integration," he stated. "What the DOJ calls anti-competitive, the consumer calls progress." Microsoft also emphasized that Internet Explorer was offered for free. They questioned how a free product could be construed as anti-competitive when consumers were the ones reaping the financial benefits. The idea was simple. Competition wasn't being stifled, it was being redefined through better, cheaper offerings. But beneath the confident facade, the defense began to strain under the weight of mounting evidence. DOJ attorney David Boies masterfully deconstructed Microsoft's claims during cross-examinations, exposing inconsistencies between the company's public statements and its internal communications. Emails where Microsoft executives strategized to increase the cost of Netscape's business and divert web traffic to our ecosystem starkly contradicted the narrative of consumer-focused innovation. The courtroom witnessed a pivotal moment when Boies played deposition videos of Bill Gates, clips where Gates appeared evasive, parsing definitions of basic terms like market share and integration with almost pedantic stubbornness. To observers, these weren't the words of a visionary innovator. They were the calculated responses of a CEO deeply aware of the legal implications his words carried. While Microsoft's defense maintained logical coherence on the surface, it began to lose persuasive power as the trial progressed. The sheer volume of internal documentation, coupled with credible testimonies from Netscape, Sun Microsystems, and OEM partners, painted a picture of a company whose integration strategies were less about enhancing user experience and more about foreclosing competitive threats. Still, Microsoft clung to its central thesis: success was not a crime.
Bundling, incentivizing OEMs, and embedding proprietary standards were all part of a competitive, innovative market. The company portrayed itself as a victim of regulatory overreach, a pioneer punished for its ambition. But as the proceedings wore on, it became evident that the defense's logical arguments were beginning to falter under the emotional and factual weight of the prosecution's case. The narrative was slipping from Microsoft's control, and the courtroom's focus was shifting toward the intent behind their strategies, not just the technicalities of their implementation. The question was no longer whether Microsoft was innovative, it was whether that innovation had morphed into systemic coercion.
Every courtroom drama has a turning point, a moment where the balance tilts not through grand gestures, but a single revelation that cuts through the legal fog. For Microsoft, that moment arrived when an internal email, once buried deep within the company's labyrinthine communication archives, was read aloud in open court. The email, authored by Microsoft Vice President James Alchin in early 1997, was chilling in its clarity. "We need to leverage Windows tightly to Internet Explorer in order to gain browser share," it stated. "We do not have the luxury of being fair." The last sentence echoed through the courtroom, a stark admission that Microsoft's strategy wasn't about enhancing the user experience, it was about obliterating the competition at any cost. David Boies, with his signature calm, let the words linger before moving to the next exhibit. Another email from Christian Wildfire, a Microsoft executive, who wrote, "It seems clear that it will be very hard to increase browser share on the merits of Internet Explorer alone. It will be more important to leverage the Windows asset to make people use Internet Explorer instead of Navigator." These were not theoretical discussions, they were confessions of intent, proof that Microsoft's integration of Internet Explorer was less about innovation and more about weaponizing its operating system dominance. But the prosecution's bombshells didn't stop there. A former Intel executive, Avidis Tavanian, took the stand to testify how Microsoft had threatened to withhold support for Intel's microprocessor innovations unless the chipmaker backed away from developing software that might compete with Windows. This revelation expanded the scope of Microsoft's alleged coercion, showing that their influence extended beyond software into the very hardware infrastructure of the industry. The courtroom atmosphere shifted palpably. What had been framed as a legal debate over bundling strategies was now being recast as a pattern of systemic intimidation. Each email, each testimony, chipped away at the veneer of Microsoft's consumer-friendly narrative, exposing a corporate culture where market dominance wasn't a fortunate byproduct. It was the primary objective, pursued through any means necessary. One of the most dramatic moments came when Boies unveiled an internal presentation slide from a Microsoft strategy meeting, titled simply, "Netscape, the Final Blow." The slide outlined tactical moves to cut off Netscape's access to distribution channels, using exclusive deals with ISPs, OEMs, and software developers to ensure Internet Explorer's dominance. It was a blueprint not of competition, but of eradication. Microsoft's defense scrambled to contain the damage. John Warden argued that internal discussions, however aggressive, were common in any competitive industry and didn't necessarily translate to anti-competitive behavior. But the defense's rebuttals began to feel like legal gymnastics, strained and disconnected from the visceral impact of the evidence now on record. The media seized upon these revelations. Headlines blared phrases like, "The email that could break Microsoft," and "Inside Gates's war room, the strategy to kill Netscape." Public opinion, which had been cautiously ambivalent, began to sour. The image of Microsoft as a benevolent innovator was being replaced by a far more menacing archetype, a digital monopolist orchestrating a silent war on choice itself. Bill Gates, who had thus far avoided the witness stand, found himself in an increasingly precarious position. His video deposition clips, previously aired to moderate effect, now took on a different tone. His evasions, his semantic debates over words like market and competition, no longer seemed like the careful precision of a tech visionary. They now appeared as deliberate obfuscations from a man fully aware of the implications his company faced. The trial had reached a pivotal inflection point. What began as a battle over browser bundling had evolved into an exposé of how unchecked corporate power could silently restructure an entire industry. The DOJ's case wasn't alive, it was thriving, emboldened by a trail of digital footprints Microsoft had inadvertently left behind. The empire was still standing, but for the first time, its foundation was visibly cracking.
By early 1999, the courtroom had transformed into a battlefield where Microsoft's meticulously controlled public image was unraveling under relentless scrutiny. The atmosphere inside Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson's chamber grew denser with every hearing, every document, every cross-examination feeding a palpable sense that the case had transcended mere legal argument. It had become a referendum on corporate power in the digital age. The testimonies were no longer just technical deep dives into APIs and bundling contracts. They were portraits of an industry bending under Microsoft's weight. Witness after witness took the stand, not merely to recount legal infractions, but to describe an ecosystem where innovation lived or died at Microsoft's discretion. Executives from Apple, Sun Microsystems, Real Networks, and several smaller software firms detailed how they had been strong-armed, marginalized, or systematically frozen out of critical distribution channels because they had dared to compete outside of Microsoft's terms. One of the trial's most electrifying moments came during the cross-examination of Jim Barksdale, former CEO of Netscape. David Boies guided Barksdale through a series of internal Microsoft documents that detailed the browser war strategy, the calculated steps taken to deprive Netscape of oxygen. Barksdale, with calm precision, explained how Microsoft's control of OEMs had turned Netscape from a dominant market force into a company fighting for survival, not through technological inferiority, but because distribution channels had been sealed off. Outside the courtroom, the media was relentless. The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post ran front-page exposés titled The Microsoft Papers, revealing internal memos that painted a chilling picture of strategic sabotage. Editorials began to frame the trial not as a legal skirmish, but as the corporate equivalent of a constitutional crisis. What happens when a single company becomes the de facto regulator of an entire industry? The market began reacting. Analysts, once bullish on Microsoft's invincibility, started issuing cautious reports, speculating about potential remedies. Would the DOJ seek to break up Microsoft, as it had done to AT&T? Could Gates's empire be forcibly cleaved into separate entities for operating systems and applications? Microsoft's stock, though still robust, showed signs of vulnerability, a tremor beneath the surface of Redmond's once unshakable confidence. Inside Microsoft, the leadership circle was tense. Internal emails, later leaked, reveal the company grappling with the gravity of the situation. Gates, ever the strategist, urged focus and defiance, while other executives quietly discussed contingency plans. Some debated whether a settlement might be preferable to a protracted public evisceration, but the prevailing sentiment remained combative. Microsoft had built an empire by out-innovating and outmaneuvering its rivals. Conceding now was an alien concept. But cracks were forming within Microsoft's own ranks. Lower-level employees, disillusioned by the trial's revelations, began speaking to the press under anonymity. They described a corporate culture where success was measured not just in market share, but in the elimination of rivals. The narrative of a scrappy startup battling IBM had long since faded. In its place was a behemoth that had, in some eyes, become what it once rebelled against. The public proceedings took an even more dramatic turn when Judge Jackson expressed visible frustration with Microsoft's defense. His pointed questions to Microsoft's attorneys revealed a growing impatience with their attempts to downplay or recontextualize the damning evidence. Jackson's courtroom demeanor became a barometer of the trial's trajectory, measured yet increasingly skeptical of Microsoft's narratives. As the trial entered its later stages, the crescendo was undeniable. The evidence had stacked, the witnesses had spoken, and the press had amplified every revelation to a public that was beginning to see Microsoft less as an innovator and more as an empire builder who had lost sight of competitive fairness.
The question was no longer whether Microsoft had engaged in monopolistic behavior. It was what consequences such behavior warranted.
On November 5, 1999, Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson delivered a ruling that would reverberate through Silicon Valley and Wall Street alike. In a findings of fact document spanning over 200 pages, Jackson concluded that Microsoft had abused its monopoly power to crush competitors and stifle innovation. The verdict was not couched in legal euphemisms. It was scathing, direct, and unequivocal. Microsoft's actions have harmed consumers in ways that are immediate and easily discernible, Jackson wrote. He detailed how the company's bundling of Internet Explorer was not a benefit to users, but a calculated strategy to eliminate Netscape as a viable competitor. The court found that Microsoft had maintained its monopoly power by anti-competitive means and attempted to monopolize the web browser market. But the most damning aspect of Jackson's ruling was not in its recitation of facts, it was in its tone. The judgment described a corporate culture of arrogance, where success bred entitlement, and where Microsoft's leaders had repeatedly chosen coercion over competition. The company, Jackson concluded, had violated both Section 1 and Section 2 of the Sherman Antitrust Act, engaging in predatory tactics that undermined the very principles of free market competition. The financial markets reacted with a mix of shock and grim anticipation. Microsoft's stock, which had withstood the earlier stages of the trial with relative resilience, began to wobble under the weight of potential remedies. Analysts debated openly whether the company would face a structural breakup, a forced division of its operating system and application software businesses, akin to the dismemberment of Standard Oil in 1911. In internal meetings, Microsoft's leadership was defiant. Bill Gates denounced the ruling as a grave judicial overreach, insisting that Microsoft had never coerced anyone, and that consumers had always benefited from Microsoft's relentless pursuit of integration and innovation. Publicly, Microsoft vowed to appeal. But behind closed doors, contingency plans were being drafted for the possibility of a government-mandated breakup. The Department of Justice and the Coalition of State Attorneys General proposed a remedy that would split Microsoft into two separate entities, one focusing on operating systems, Windows, and the other on software applications, Office, Internet Explorer, etc. The logic was clear. By separating the platform from the applications, Microsoft's ability to use its OS monopoly as a weapon against competitors would be dismantled. But the remedy wasn't universally embraced. Critics of the breakup plan argued that technological markets evolve too rapidly for such structural solutions to be effective. The fear was that a breakup, while symbolically powerful, might fail to address the nuanced ways in which digital platforms could exert control. Microsoft's legal and lobbying teams intensified their efforts, leveraging political connections and public relations campaigns to frame the breakup as a draconian overreaction that would stifle American innovation and embolden foreign competitors. The narrative shifted from corporate misconduct to national economic interest, a powerful pivot that found receptive audiences in Congress and the incoming Bush administration. Despite Microsoft's appeals, Judge Jackson remained firm. On June 7, 2000, he issued his final judgment. Microsoft would be split into two companies pending appeals. The verdict was delivered with a sense of finality, a hammer striking down on a tech empire that had, in the court's view, crossed the line from brilliance into brazen abuse of power. Yet even as the court's decision seemed to seal Microsoft's fate, the battle was far from over. The appeals process loomed, political winds were shifting, and backroom negotiations were intensifying. The breakup order was a thunderous blow, but whether it would ever be executed was a question still hanging in the balance. For Microsoft, the gavel had fallen, but in the corridors of power and influence, a new phase of the war had just begun.
The immediate aftermath of Judge Jackson's breakup order sent shockwaves through Wall Street. Microsoft stock, which had weathered years of antitrust scrutiny with relative defiance, finally buckled. Within hours of the ruling on June 7, 2000, Microsoft's market capitalization shed nearly $40 billion, a stark reminder that even titans bleed when cornered. Investors, once enthralled by Microsoft's aura of invincibility, grew jittery. The specter of a corporate breakup, a remedy unseen since the dismemberment of AT&T, hung heavy over Redmond. Analysts, once bullish on Microsoft's ability to pivot and adapt, began issuing cautious forecasts. The legal quagmire was no longer a theoretical risk, it was an existential threat. Inside Microsoft, the leadership circle was forced into a rare moment of introspection. Bill Gates, whose relentless vision had transformed a garage project into a global superpower, faced a crossroads. His public defiance remained, but internally the cracks of exhaustion were showing. Years of legal battles had diverted focus, morale within key divisions was fraying, and the narrative that Microsoft was being punished for its success no longer resonated as strongly with the public or with policymakers. On January 13, 2000, amidst mounting pressure and a shifting tech landscape, Gates announced he was stepping down as CEO, transitioning into the role of Chief Software Architect. The mantle of leadership passed to Steve Ballmer, a longtime Microsoft stalwart, known for his bombastic energy and fierce loyalty. The move was positioned as a strategic pivot. Gates would focus on innovation, while Ballmer would manage the operational and political battles ahead. But the timing was no coincidence. Gates's resignation from the CEO role was as much a public relations maneuver as it was a leadership restructuring. Microsoft needed a new face, someone to absorb the incoming fire, while Gates, the embattled architect of the empire, retreated from the direct line of regulatory fire. Under Ballmer, Microsoft adopted a more conciliatory tone. The defiance of the Gates era gave way to calculated pragmatism. Microsoft increased its lobbying efforts in Washington, restructured internal teams to demonstrate compliance readiness, and sought to repair strained relationships with OEM partners and software developers who had grown wary of the company's iron grip. But the damage was not limited to leadership shifts. Microsoft's once soaring stock price, which had peaked during the dot-com boom, began to languish. The combination of antitrust uncertainty and the bursting of the broader tech bubble eroded investor confidence. Between January 2000 and December 2000, Microsoft's share price fell by over 50%, a staggering decline for a company that had seemed untouchable mere months prior. Internally, departments faced budget freezes, product timelines were delayed, and key talent began drifting toward emerging startups, seduced by the promise of agility and freedom absent in Microsoft's increasingly bureaucratic culture. But Microsoft was far from defeated. The empire had been wounded, but it was not collapsing. Ballmer's leadership marked a strategic shift, less overt dominance, more strategic partnerships. The lessons from the courtroom were slowly permeating through Redmond's corridors, albeit begrudgingly. But the scars were undeniable. Gates's resignation, the plunging stock, and the court-ordered breakup had exposed Microsoft's vulnerabilities in ways the company had never anticipated. The days of unchecked expansion were over. A new era of scrutiny, adaptation, and cautious recalibration had begun. The question now wasn't just how Microsoft would respond, but how the entire technology industry would reshape itself in the wake of its most powerful players' public reckoning. The antitrust war against Microsoft was never just a trial of one company. It became a crucible for the entire technology industry. In the wake of Judge Jackson's ruling and Bill Gates' departure from the CEO role, a ripple effect coursed through Silicon Valley and beyond. The message was loud and unmistakable. No tech empire, no matter how innovative, was beyond the reach of regulatory scrutiny. From Microsoft's competitors, long marginalized under the weight of its platform dominance, the court's findings acted as a clarion call. Companies that had once treaded cautiously now found new confidence in challenging the status quo. Netscape, though irreparably damaged, had sown the seeds of its own legacy by open sourcing its browser code,
giving birth to the Mozilla Foundation and eventually Firefox, a browser that would reignite competition in a space Microsoft had sought to dominate unchallenged. Meanwhile, Sun Microsystems, emboldened by the court's recognition of Microsoft's anti-competitive tactics, doubled down on promoting Java as a platform-independent language, envisioning a future where applications could run seamlessly across devices without being tethered to Windows. Though Sun's broader business struggles would persist, its antitrust crusade had left an indelible mark on how the industry viewed platform control. The most profound impact, however, was cultural. For years, startups and developers had operated under the implicit assumption that crossing Microsoft was a death sentence. The trial fractured that narrative. Entrepreneurs began to see new pathways to challenge incumbents, not through brute force, but by exploiting the very agility and openness Microsoft's size had compromised. The door was opening for a new generation of companies who would build not on closed ecosystems, but on the foundational principles of the open web. And in that vacuum, new titans began to rise. Google, founded in 1998, was still in its infancy during the trial, but took careful note of Microsoft's vulnerabilities. Learning from Netscape's downfall, Google deliberately structured its early strategies to avoid dependency on any single platform. The ethos of "don't be evil," once a simple internal motto, became a positioning statement designed to contrast sharply with Microsoft's image as a monopolistic juggernaut. At the same time, Apple, teetering on the brink of irrelevance just years prior, found a renewed sense of purpose. Under the returning leadership of Steve Jobs, Apple shifted focus from competing directly with Microsoft in the PC space to redefining adjacent industries through innovation, beginning with the iPod and later the iPhone. The lesson was clear. To survive in a Microsoft-dominated world, you had to build ecosystems they couldn't easily replicate or co-opt. Regulators, too, underwent a transformation. The Microsoft case became a foundation reference point for how governments worldwide approached digital monopolies. In the European Union, antitrust authorities initiated their own probes into Microsoft's bundling practices, setting a precedent for aggressive regulatory action against tech giants, a legacy that would later ensnare companies like Google, Apple, Amazon, and Facebook. The industry's playbook evolved. Companies became more cautious about overt market dominance strategies, understanding that visibility could invite legal challenges. Platform neutrality, open source initiatives, and consumer choice narratives became not just marketing buzzwords, but strategic shields against the perception of monopolistic behavior. But perhaps the most lasting shift was psychological. The Microsoft trial shattered the illusion of technological determinism, that innovation alone would regulate market behavior. It exposed the uncomfortable truth that even the most visionary companies could veer into anti-competitive territory, not out of malice, but out of an insatiable drive to win. The antitrust hammer had fallen, but its echo reshaped an entire generation of corporate strategy. The age of unchecked digital empires was over, or so it seemed.
Though the court's decision to break up Microsoft was ultimately overturned on appeal, the scars left by the antitrust trial ran deep, etched into the company's culture, its reputation, and the broader psyche of the technology industry. The empire remained intact, but it was forever changed. In 2001, the U.S. Court of Appeals upheld Judge Jackson's findings of fact, but vacated the breakup order, citing procedural missteps and judicial bias due to Jackson's off-the-record comments to the media. The case concluded with a settlement that, while falling short of structural remedies, imposed behavioral restrictions on Microsoft. The company agreed to share application programming interfaces, or APIs, with third-party developers, refrain from retaliatory practices against OEMs, and accept the appointment of an independent compliance panel to oversee its conduct for 5 years. On paper, it was a compromise. Microsoft had avoided the corporate guillotine. But in reality, the company had been deeply wounded, not financially, but existentially.
The swagger of the 1990s, where Gates and his inner circle dictated industry direction with unapologetic dominance, gave way to a culture of cautious maneuvering. Microsoft became more introspective, less overtly aggressive in its market strategies, aware that every move was now under a regulatory magnifying glass. The Bill Gates who had once sparred with regulators from a position of invincibility gradually receded from Microsoft's day-to-day operations. His pivot towards philanthropy through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation marked not just a personal transformation, but a symbolic retreat from the image of a ruthless monopolist. The narrative shifted from the combative CEO to the benevolent philanthropist. Yet for many, the scars of Microsoft's antitrust saga remained a defining chapter of Gates's legacy. The company's internal culture also evolved. Engineers and executives who had lived through the trial described a palpable shift in the company's DNA. Microsoft, once the gorilla of Silicon Valley, began adopting a more collaborative tone, cautiously engaging with open-source initiatives and fostering partnerships that a decade earlier would have been unthinkable. The rise of Linux, an open-source operating system that Microsoft had once labeled as a cancer, became emblematic of this forced humility. Yet the public's trust didn't heal overnight. For years, Microsoft's brand carried the weight of its antitrust past. Media narratives, academic case studies, and industry folklore consistently referenced Microsoft as the archetype of how market dominance, if left unchecked, could curdle into systemic abuse. Every strategic move the company made, whether launching a new product or acquiring a promising startup, was scrutinized through the lens of its monopolistic history. The long-term impact wasn't just reputational. The trial had fundamentally altered Microsoft's trajectory. As the tech landscape pivoted toward mobile computing, cloud services, and social media, Microsoft, once the undisputed king of the desktop, struggled to assert its dominance. The cautious, compliance-driven culture forged in the fires of the antitrust trial made the company slower to innovate in emerging markets where speed and boldness were critical. While Microsoft would eventually find resurgence under new leadership in the 2010s, its role as the all-encompassing gatekeeper of technology had been irrevocably dismantled. The antitrust scars didn't kill the company, but they permanently reshaped its ambitions, forcing a reckoning with the limits of power and the responsibilities that accompany it. For the broader tech industry, Microsoft's fall from untouchable supremacy served as both a cautionary tale and a playbook. Future tech giants watched, learned, and adapted, not necessarily avoiding Microsoft's mistakes, but becoming far more sophisticated in how they wielded their influence. The shadows of Redmond's antitrust battle would loom over every major tech monopoly fight in the decades to come. Microsoft survived, but it would never again be the same.
The Microsoft antitrust case stands as a masterclass in both the seduction and the perils of unchecked market power. For business leaders, policymakers, and aspiring entrepreneurs, it remains an enduring reminder that the line between competitive brilliance and monopolistic abuse is not defined by intent, but by structure, and once crossed, it is nearly impossible to retreat unscathed. Perhaps the most striking lesson lies in the illusion of invincibility. Microsoft's empire was not built on fraud or deception. It was born from a relentless drive to innovate, to integrate, and to dominate through superior products. Yet that very ambition became its Achilles heel, when scale transformed strategic advantage into structural control. Dominance, when achieved, demands a shift in corporate philosophy, from expansion to stewardship. Microsoft's failure was not in becoming dominant, but in refusing to adapt its competitive playbook once it controlled the levers of the digital economy. For CEOs and founders, the case is a cautionary tale about narrative blindness. Bill Gates and his leadership team genuinely believed they were serving consumers by offering integrated, seamless experiences. But in their pursuit of efficiency, they ignored the broader ecosystem impact, the suffocation of choice, the coercion of partners, the quiet dismantling of open competition.
Corporate success breeds echo chambers, where internal victories are mistaken for marketplace validation. Microsoft's downfall began not in a courtroom, but in boardrooms where dissenting voices were muted by the roar of market dominance. Investors and boards must also glean a critical insight. Short-term monopolistic gains often carry long-term existential costs. Microsoft's bundling strategies delivered immediate market share victories, but the reputational and legal backlash eroded years of goodwill, stifled innovation, and delayed the company's ability to pivot into emerging markets like mobile and cloud. The antitrust battle didn't bankrupt Microsoft, but it cost the company its agility, a consequence far more insidious than financial penalties. For policymakers and regulators, the case underscored the importance of vigilance in fast-moving industries. Laws crafted in the age of steel and oil proved capable, when wielded with nuance, to address digital monopolies. But the lag between technological evolution and regulatory action allowed Microsoft's conduct to persist unchecked for years. The Microsoft trial became a textbook argument for proactive oversight, continuous market analysis, and the necessity of understanding not just products, but platforms. Startups and disruptors, too, carry a lesson forward. The early internet was a playground where innovation flourished, until one player's gravitational pull reshaped the entire landscape. Competing against a platform owner demands strategic foresight, alliances, and sometimes the humility to recognize when open source models or alternative ecosystems offer better survival paths than direct confrontation. Netscape's eventual pivot to open source laid the groundwork for Firefox's success, a testament to the resilience that comes from community-driven innovation. But perhaps the deepest reflection is philosophical. The Microsoft case challenged the romantic notion that the market is self-correcting. It revealed that in networked industries, where scale begets scale, the invisible hand often needs a visible counterbalance. The health of an open, competitive market relies not only on entrepreneurial grit, but on structural checks that prevent any one entity from dictating the rules of the game. In the years that followed, Microsoft would rebuild, rebrand, and reimagine itself under new leadership. But the shadow of its antitrust saga loomed long, a silent advisor in every strategic decision, every product launch, every M&A negotiation. For the corporate world, the story of Microsoft is not of villainy, but of ambition untethered by accountability, a reminder that in the relentless pursuit of winning, the most dangerous blind spot is forgetting why you started competing in the first place.
As the dust settled on the Microsoft antitrust trial, a peculiar paradox emerged. The company had survived, intact, yet transformed, humbled, but not dismantled. But while Microsoft's reckoning had concluded within the confines of Judge Jackson's courtroom, the broader questions it had unearthed remained unanswered, questions that would resurface, louder and more complex, in the decades to follow. The digital economy did not slow after Microsoft's trial. It accelerated. New empires rose: Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, each mastering different facets of the digital frontier. Search, e-commerce, mobile platforms, social ecosystems all became new battlegrounds where network effects and platform control dictated competitive dynamics. The lessons of Microsoft were studied, internalized, and in many cases strategically sidestepped by these emerging giants. But the core tension persisted. At what point does success calcify into structural dominance? How do we define harm in markets where products are free but competition is suffocated through control of data, algorithms, and distribution channels? Microsoft's browser bundling seemed almost quaint compared to the labyrinthine ecosystems of modern tech giants who orchestrated entire digital lives within walled gardens. Ironically, as these new monopolies took shape, Microsoft found itself repositioned, not as the omnipotent villain, but as a reformed giant navigating a world it had once ruled. Under new leadership, the company leaned into collaboration, open-source contributions, and a more modular approach to product ecosystems. It was no longer the disruptor, but a participant in a far more complex digital oligarchy. Regulators, too, evolved. The Microsoft case became a legal Rosetta Stone for how to approach tech monopolies. In the European Union, antitrust actions intensified, targeting not only Microsoft, but also Google, Apple, and Amazon. In the US, a new wave of antitrust scrutiny was brewing, fueled by rising public awareness of how platform dominance affects privacy, free speech, and market fairness. The tactics had changed, but the structural risks remained eerily familiar. The future of antitrust enforcement in the digital age remains a battlefield of nuance. The Microsoft case demonstrated that legal remedies, while necessary, often lag behind technological realities. By the time regulatory frameworks catch up, the market has often shifted, creating new vectors of dominance. This cycle, innovation, domination, regulation, evasion, continues to spin, each rotation more complex than the last. For Microsoft, the antitrust scars became a form of corporate wisdom, guiding its strategic choices and softening its public posture. But the broader legacy of the case is not confined to Redmond. It's a living file, consulted every time a new tech titan pushes the boundaries of acceptable market behavior, every time policymakers debate how to balance innovation with accountability. The story of Microsoft's monopoly wasn't just a chapter in the history of Silicon Valley. It was a blueprint for the age of digital empires, a reminder that in the pursuit of progress, vigilance is not optional. Power, when left unchecked, has the habit of rewriting the rules. The case was closed, but the playbook remains open. The file is closed, for now.